Okay, everyone, here is the final segment of the video review for chapter 17 for the test. So what I want to do now in this final segment is talk you through phase 2. So just like phase 1 had some major developments and then led to changes, so too will phase 2 have different developments which will impact those same categories we looked at during phase 1, but this time in slightly different ways. So first, let's begin by outlining phase 2 of the Industrial Revolution. You can see I have 3 bullet points here and they correlate to the 3 categories over here. So let's move to the mental map. So the first revolution within phase 2 of the Industrial Revolution that we have occurring is this revolution in steel. And remember, why is steel an improvement over iron? Because it's stronger. It's as simple as that. And that strength in steel over iron is going to have an impact on transportation and urbanization. So regarding transportation, those steamships are going to be built out of steel instead of iron, as are the engines that power them. Same thing will go for trains, allowing both steamships and trains to become bigger, better, stronger, faster. In regards to urbanization, remember the impact of steel is that instead of building cities out horizontally, steel is going to allow for taller buildings because now you can support the weight of those taller buildings. So cities for the first time are going to see skyscrapers, or cities are going to grow up as well as out. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is the chemical revolution. This is probably one that has the most impact on all of the different categories we'll be looking at in a second. In agriculture, we have fertilizers. And remember, fertilizers are both good and bad. They're pollutants, but at the same time, they allow us to grow crops that are better, healthier, and grow more of them. Regarding transportation, we can use explosives for the first time to actually help us build canals, build tunnels through mountains, things like that, to facilitate both sea travel and land travel. Regarding health, this is the most important one. Make sure you pay attention to this. We're talking about the medicines that are being developed here. This is going to have a huge impact on the health of people in cities, which, remember, they were dying left and right before. Now that we have medicines, this will improve those conditions and just conditions for people throughout the world in general. But the other impact that we mentioned in class is that eventually this is going to allow the Europeans to invade and go to the interior of Africa. So it's related to colonialism as well. Now, if we look down at consumer goods, there were a lot of them listed in SPODEC, but the most important one I want you to realize here and pay attention to is the use of plastics. Plastics dominate our lives today, and it comes from this second phase of the Industrial Revolution. And then finally, over here, our third bullet point is the electrical revolution. Now, all you need to know technologically wise is that electricity is going to be used both for electric lights and to power the machines. The more important bit that I want you to pay attention to here is Menlo Park, which was created by Thomas Edison and is our first really R&D, or research and development lab. Businesses now as a standard have an R&D, or research and development component, so they continue to innovate. And remember, this links back to competition, which is a hallmark of capitalism. And if you're not innovating, you're not going to be able to compete, and therefore you're not going to be able to gain profit. The impact of electricity on cities is you're going to be able to have better sewer systems developing. You're also going to have safer cities by the incorporation of streetlights, which, remember, you saw that happen in your village. So crime is going to decrease because of that. And these are all good things that are coming out of the Industrial Revolution. The impact of electricity on factories is that you're going to no longer be working 12 to 16-hour days, because Henry Ford realizes that you can create 3 shifts of 8 hours, thereby keeping your factory open 24 hours a day, also lessening the workday for workers and potentially creating more productive workers, which will lead to greater efficiency and more profits. So while he might not have been doing that for altruistic reasons, it's more so because of his own greed to keep his factory open 24 hours a day, still people are benefiting from it. And those are the 3 phases of the Industrial Revolution. Now, if we take a look at some of the impacts that are being created by that, let's first take a look at labor changes. So we already discussed the impact of steel, of course. We're not going to do that again. The other thing except to say that the impact of steel on how labor is being conducted is that the machines are going to get a lot bigger and a lot heavier. When that happens, and this is actually very, very crucial, when that happens, those machines get so big and heavy that, think about it, who can no longer physically really operate those big, heavy machines? Women and young children. So this is really the thing that's going to get women out of the factories and focus it more on men being factory workers. It has to do with the Corporation of Steel, the fact that the machines are going to be able to become bigger and therefore heavier. The next bit down here is that labor at this point is going to start to organize as well, so that you have workers organizing. And what do I mean by this? You're going to see your first unions and your first strikes. This does not happen too much during the first phase of industrialization. This is particularly during the second phase, once you have workers starting to realize their plight and organize against it. And then finally, you're going to start to see a need for more laborers within factories. And this is going to be the time when indentured labor starts to come into play here. This was mentioned in Spodek. And what we're talking about here are the people from India and from China who are going to come to industrialized nations. By this point, Britain, but also the United States and Germany. And they will be coming from India and China because that's where those countries have fallen into the high equilibrium trap and have excess population and need a place for those people to go. So they are going to be coming to work in our factories, in England's factories, because of that population pressure that they are facing. Now the question becomes, why does England, why does the United States need more laborers coming into work in their factories? Wasn't their population booming because of the Columbian Exchange and the Agricultural Revolution? It had been, but there is a key factor that in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution is going to lead to the decline of populations. If you remember, it's going back to what we had indicated during phase one with families and the aspect of birth rates dropping because children have become an economic burden. So, whereas before the population had been growing, what we're starting to see for the first time in the developed world is populations start to decrease, start to diminish. And it has to do with this decision on the part of families to not have as many kids as they had in the past. So these are the changes we see happening with labor as a result of the second phase of industrialization. Now moving to the factory system. Conditions in factories are still pretty bad, but they've started to increase and get better because you do have them being well lit now due to electricity. You do have one bad aspect, though, that you do have is that with the chemical revolution, you have people working with a lot more chemicals, and therefore you're going to see for the first time things like cancer start to emerge. So good and bad changes happening with the factory system regarding conditions. The workday, this is definitely a plus. It's becoming shorter, 8 hours a day. Why? Once again, going back to Henry Ford so that he can fit 3 shifts into one 24-hour period. Also, as a positive, the impact on leisure time. People living in the cities in particular are going to have more leisure time because they're only working 8 hours a day. And with 8 hours a day instead of 12 to 16, they now have a lot of free time on their hand. Capitalists are going to take advantage of that. What are they going to start to develop in cities? Entertainment districts. Now you're going to see your first theaters. Now you're going to see your first museums. People have all this leisure time on their hands. What's the capitalist going to do? What's their goal? Make money, right? So they're going to take advantage of that, build these places for people to come and spend all of their money in their free time that they now have. The thing to keep in mind here, though, is that people that are farmers do not have the same amount of leisure time as people in the cities. This is just an urban phenomenon. People that are farming still have to work from sunrise to sunset. Next, factory system is becoming, you're starting to see monopolies and cartels develop. And I'm not going to talk through them again here because we actually addressed them in an earlier part of this presentation. So just to know that Factories and capitalists don't like competition, and therefore they're going to start to form monopolies and cartels within factories. Now, the thing going along with that, though, that we hadn't discussed in class but was in Spodek, is that you're going to see an integration of industry as well. And a good example here is to think about the car industry. What capitalists are going to begin to do is if they manufacture cars, they're going to not only buy up car industries, the factories that actually make cars, but they're also going to buy things like rubber plantations, because then they control the rubber that's going to be used for the tires. They might end up purchasing steel factories, because then they control the steel as well as the rubber. They might actually become involved in like cattle ranching so that they can produce the leather. So what companies will do to integrate an industry is buy up all of the other companies that produce the raw materials that they then use to make their car. So this is integration of the factory system. Okay, we have one final thing to look at. So let me pull up the image of the backboard and we can talk through this. Still second phase of the Industrial Revolution. Let's talk about gender. We see something different now happening with this second phase of Industrial Revolution regarding gender. We see women being pushed out of the factories. Remember the reason for this. Steel is making the machines bigger and heavier, and physically this is going to become something that the men are going to be able to do better than women. So we see women not being able to work in these factories any longer, and therefore something has to happen. What we see as a result of this is a separation between public and private space, private space being the home and being the place that women are supposed to be, public space being the factories out in public life and being the purview of men. So we see this division for the first time between public and private space. The other thing we see going on is that some women don't want to give up that freedom of working. So there has to be a way to convince women that it's more desirable to stay home and be a housewife. This is where the cult of domesticity really begins. Women's magazines start to be published that are going to say the following. If you have a woman in your family who is working, it's an indication that you live in poverty. Only women who are poor have to go out and work to help to support their family. What it attaches to this idea of women working is a lower social status, and nobody wants to be perceived as being poor. So women, the goal for them is going to become a stay-at-home mom, because if they are a stay-at-home mom, wife, and mother, that shows that they are wealthy or of an upper-class status. So the cult of domesticity is going to place a status on this idea of work and make it undesirable for women to do so. And like I said, you see a lot of women's magazines and things like this propagating these ideas. The last thing that we see happening only after the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, and keep in mind for the top two, cult of domesticity and public versus private, what's the thing happening in the second phase that's going to lead to this? It's the steel. The steel makes the machines heavier, and that's the link here. So it's going back directly to that. And then the final two, suffrage and World War I. Women are going to start to organize for the right to vote. And the whole reason behind this is the logic of what happens during World War I. World War I, the men have to go and fight in the war. The women are left behind, but they still need the factories to produce weapons. So the women are going to go and going to work in these factories. Now, their argument for getting the right to vote is interesting. They're going to argue that they pay taxes just like men because they were working just like men. And if they are paying taxes to the government, then they have a right to say how that tax money is being used. And this, along with the idea that women kind of prove themselves in World War I as being beneficial to society, is going to make men vote to allow women the right to vote. And this is suffrage. Two more categories. Let's look at government reactions. Unlike the first phase of industrialization, where the government really tries to maintain this whole idea of land equals power with the Corn Laws and using violence to kind of repress people who are rebelling, instead we see the government embracing certain types of reforms. And I'm not going to go through them now. There's a whole list of them in Spodek. You have it on your study guide. You can go back and look at some of the reforms that they were doing. The other thing that governments begin to do is embrace this whole idea of finance capital. What is finance capital? It's this idea that once you have industrialized, industrialized, it's profitable to help other countries to industrialize as well. So, for example, Britain is going to invest in building railroads in the United States. In addition to that, in Russia, France, the United States, and Britain are going to help Russia to build their railroads. So it's this idea that once industrialization has taken hold, you can actually make a profit by helping other countries industrialize. They're going to need loan money to actually build these big public works projects, and you have already industrialized. You have capital that you can give to them and finance their railroads, and potentially you can make a huge profit. So this is another thing that governments are doing. And then finally, what you read about just the other day, cities. Because of the medicine and the chemical phase of the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, health increases dramatically in cities. Cities actually become really good places to live. Mortality rates drop substantially. And even despite that, though, there are still those people that don't like cities because they think that people are anonymous there. People don't know each other anymore. All of those social connections are being lost in cities. And there's a huge debate, which Spodek talks about, between people who think cities are good for people socially, and people who think cities are really bad and that we should go back to a small village life where everyone knew everyone. One of the groups, though, that stands out and is going to be arguing that cities are actually really good places and have communities of their own within the cities is the Chicago School. So the Chicago School is really important to know. What they argue is that they actually went into cities and looked at the little small neighborhoods, and they're going to make the argument that these little neighborhoods like Chinatown, Little Italy, are very much like small village life. It's taking place within a larger city. So that cities, to think of them as these huge places where nobody knows anybody else, it's just wrong. Cities have communities. Cities have things called ethnic enclaves. And an ethnic enclave is Chinatown. It's this one place in the city where everybody from a certain ethnicity goes and lives. Why do they decide to all live together? Well, they all speak the same language. They all go to the same religious institution. They all have the same practices. They all eat the same foods. So they're going to live together and then have Latino stores for grocery in that neighborhood because they are all Latino. That's just one example. So the Chicago School is going to fight against this idea that cities are bad and small village life is the only place you have connections. The Chicago School is going to say that no, cities have neighborhoods, they have ethnic enclaves, and people know each other in these situations as well. And it's very much like small village life. It looks different, but socially it's very much the same. Who's correct? You decide. Final two things. Urban districts. You'll probably know this pretty well after doing the village activity, but once you have the poor sections and the wealthy sections developing, you have even more districts developing. So you're going to have factory districts be developing once they no longer have to be by the river and can be elsewhere. They're going to end up putting all the factories together. Why? Because factories are dirty and polluting. Nobody wants to live by them. So you'll have factory districts. And we even still do today. We call them industrial centers, industrial districts. Greenfield, for example, is an example of this out by Costco. So Greenfield is an industrial district. Usually they are on the outskirts of a city. Within the city, you have a political district or a downtown where all of your government offices usually are. You have a theater district typically. You have a shopping district typically. Think of any large city. You have different districts, and they're really based on like what's happening in that particular area. So theater, this is where all your theaters are. Shopping, this is where all of your shops are, and so forth. And then finally, the last thing that happens with regards to cities is that these people up here do have an argument. There is an argument to be made about people becoming divorced from the environment and not having access to like green spaces, open spaces with plant life. So what you're going to see is a movement within cities to create gardens, garden spaces, these spaces where people can connect with the environment. And it's a mainstay of almost every city in the world today. In Lancaster, we have Central Park. New York City, of course, you have Central Park as well. In Philadelphia, you have many little parks dispersed all throughout the city. And so people do realize that cities, the way they developed isn't perfect. But in addition to that, we don't have to scrap cities completely or criticize them completely. We can change them slightly to incorporate things that people need, like open green spaces. I hope this helped. I hope you have time to listen to what you need tonight, and good luck on the exam tomorrow.